Welcome to God Talk from your chaplaincy team at CCCU. This week we are pleased to welcome Matthew Fisher. Matthew is a postgraduate scholar at Portsmouth University, runs a Hello Mormonism podcast, and is a published author. We join him just as he is discussing who Robert Radcliffe Dolling was.
And then Portsmouth, and then travelled around America for a bit, talking about it to try and raise the money of the debt he had accrued, and then ended up in Poplar, where someone at a train station stands on his foot. He becomes infected, and he doesn't worry about it because he's too busy caring for the poor, and eventually it kills him. And Clayton says that it is the job that killed him, and Joseph Clayton, who wrote the least famous of all the books, the 3 books on him, says is devastated by his death, and because of that he pours out his grief in this memoir. But Father Dolling was considered in Victorian England a sort of one of the great leaders of the ritualist movement. And so if you were to buy an early 20th century or late 19th century book on great Christians or the leaders of the church in 1800 to 1900, you find that Father Dolling gets his own chapter in there. And yet today, he, as far as I can tell, when I stumbled upon him and I started tweeting about him, and that's how Peter and I first met, where Pete goes, "Oh, I thought I was the only person that liked Dolling." And then I go, well, I thought I was the only person that sort of researched him and stuff. But he is a fascinating character. I would say if he liked you, you'd probably really like him. If he didn't like you, you would probably give him no time at all.
Yeah, he really is quite prickly, isn't it? I mean, that bit in one of the gyms, isn't it, where the guys won't stop using abusive language in front of the lady running the gym, and he bangs her head together, and his comment is, "I threw him down the stairs and near broke his legs." I mean, so he's obviously got quite a fiery temper to him.
Yeah, he seems to, if you read 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum, he seems to act first and then superimpose the justification later onto why he did what he did. And he does that about massive things like nearly breaking the guy's leg. He does it about leaving the church in Landport abruptly, albeit just a few months earlier than he planned to leave. And yet he seems very, very sort of, he seems to do stuff before he thinks about it. And what's interesting in that story is, as he talks about how they made up and basically shook hands and were mates again before the guy hit the bottom of the steps. But banging people's heads together, he was that seems to be his technique for sort of crowd control, and dragging people around seems to be his control, his idea of how to control anybody. And so, you know, today he certainly would be considered very, very abusive in the way that he was to work. He works towards people, but his sister's the same, dragging people, going in and dragging people who are becoming involved again in prostitution out of bad houses, as Dolling used to call them.
So I'm really interested. Perhaps, Matthew, you can outline Landport. Now, I remember the amazing bit in, I think it's in 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum, where Dolling talks about having to pawn his watch in order to pay the train fare to go to see the bishop. I mean, this incredible areas of deprivation. I mean, what were your impression of Landport? I mean, how poor is this area?
Well, what's really fascinating, I think it might be worth starting with Landport today. I used to live in Portsmouth, and when I lived in Portsmouth, I was I knew nothing about the guy, and I used to drive past down this sort of wide trunk road through the middle of Portsmouth, and to the left of it there is a car park, and then behind that is a multi-story car park, and behind that again is an indoor concrete, lovely built on a budget shopping centre called Cascades. And so as you walk down there today, there is no hint almost to what Landport was like, where if you look at the semi-triangular, Dolling called it an irregular square, but really it's a bit more triangular. And there's some big roads. So there's a road that used to be Unicorn Road, Edinburgh Road, and Commercial Road. Now Commercial Road's actually been rerouted. So when you look at Commercial Road today, it's not the same. But Commercial Road, or what's the old Commercial Road, includes the birthplace of Charles Dickens, which is quite a good connection, which also I think Dolling and Dickens have more connections than some people like to think. But Dolling talks about these houses already being 50 years out of date. They were too small. Some of the rows where they had built houses in the gardens of the bigger houses. Dolling, who wasn't as big as me, but was a big chap for the day, would struggle to walk down, and there were a couple of rows that he couldn't get down. But in this sort of compact area, there are crammed. Dolling likes to tell us, and his book is full of Victorian hyperbole, which is worth noting, that there are about 6,000 people that live there, and estimates are somewhere between 4,500 and 6,000. But there is these really tightly compact houses. So if you were to think, I don't know if anyone's seen the Charles Booth poverty map, but if you go to the black areas and the dark brown areas, which are the criminal classes and the really, really poor people, the people that didn't have enough of a regular income, Lamport looked like those kind of places. And that's very contemporary, so 1890s with Dolling. But today, like I said, it's a indoor car park, a trunk road leading to the dockyard, and the most famous thing about Portsmouth, probably the Gun Wharf shopping outlet, and then this indoor shopping market. And there are two illusions, or there's one main illusion to Lamport, and that is that the names inside Cascades are named after the streets and are sort of nods to like Charlotte Street and Chant Street and things like that. But there is this imposing building which I never saw when I lived there because it's hidden behind trees, and that is the now Roman Catholic Church of St. Agatha's, which at that point was Dolling's church. And it has a fascinating history. It's what causes all the problems to do with the third altar as to why he leaves. It's why 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum book exists, because Dolling writes to raise £3,090 because he owes the money to Mr. Ball and Mr. Bull, who are the architect and the one of the artists within the church. But now it's a Roman Catholic church, which creates a fascinating history in itself under the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. But there are a few streets that exist, and Commercial Road still exists. But like I said, it is a very, very different place, and Commercial Road itself is is not even the same road. It's like this is the new Commercial Road. So Dolling arrives in September 1885, and there, as far as he's concerned, he likes to tell us that there are two issues. There is poverty, which is the result of bad jobs, low wages, and drink. And Dolling is very, very keen to tell us that drink is one of the major problems within Portsmouth. And he says there's an extraordinary amount of pubs. There is one pub for every 92 people in Portsmouth, one public house for every 92 people in Portsmouth itself. And so you've got poverty is the first issue, and sin is the second issue. Now, Dolling splits sin up into male and boys and girls, male and female sins. And so his solutions for them, if you read the book, are different. He says this. He says that boys stole because stealing seemed to them to be the only method of living. So he's saying it's almost a noble way in the sense of if these boys didn't steal, they wouldn't eat. And he said men were drunken because their stomachs were empty, and that they were bored and had nothing to do. And that's part of his version of Christianity was he was very, very pro entertainment and hard work, and believing in the gymnasium of tiring the boys out to send them to bed, because then they would sin less. But then he says that girls sin because they copied the behavior of their mothers and their grandmothers. And the big concern about sin for girls was sexual immorality and prostitution.
So I'm really interested. I mean, we could talk for hours about St. Agatha. That's maybe another conversation is about St. Agatha Church, because it really is just, once you know where it is, it's hard to believe that you actually drive past it and miss it. coming back to what you were saying about Dolling using Victorian hyperbole in his language, and we know that there is a slumming movement in Victorian period. It's very fashionable to go to the slums. It's a tourist thing. I wonder, just thinking as we're talking about a lived faith, do you have any thoughts that when we look at things like Benefit Street or On Benefits and Broke, do you think that's a similar thing, or do you think what Dolling's experiencing as slumming is completely different?
I would see that, first of all, it's important to note that 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum, the book itself, is a book of slumming from your armchair in your own middle class or upper class house. The book itself is published with a nice Winchester College logo at the front. It's not a cheap copy. It's full of photographs. And it's on decent paper with decent binding. So if you're poor, you're not going to be able to afford to buy it. So I would see Dolling's book itself as slumming. But yes, I would certainly say there is a titillation and a fascination in seeing people worse off than yourself. I would say that there is that element of slumming today, and although we're not renting carriages to go and look around these places, or we're not buying beautifully embossed blue coated blue hardback books to see people in poverty, but I think the fact that these programs are successful, and I think also of Can't Pay Will Take It Away, which in itself can be an addictive program to watch. And so I'm not sure. And I think Seth Coven is the guy that wrote a really interesting book on slumming. Although some of the things he says about Dolling I don't agree with. I would say yes, that it is the same thing that we look at, because none of these places offer solutions. If that makes sense. So Can't Pay Will Take It Away, or Benefit Street, or all of these things, they're not offering these solutions to these people. And that's where someone who was slumming compared to someone like Dolling is very different. Because yes, Dolling is middle class, and he isn't part of the the working, lower, more disturbed, as he might say, classes. And even he won't even let his sisters live in Lamport itself, so they live further out in the parish of All Saints, which is the church that sort of within the parish that the mission was. But I would say yes, slumming continues to be a problem today, and I personally don't see it as any different. I just say the measures of poverty are different. So if we go back to Dolling's day, we see that people who were so poor couldn't eat and couldn't live. And he tells a story about how being given £5, he basically was given £5, gave this person £5, and that made their life, in the sense of they managed to piece together a place to live and then work, because that little gift of £5 had made all the difference to them. But I look today and I go, I think that's the difference, is trying to find solutions to these problems, and perhaps that's part of the historians and the theologians and sort of also the Church of England's and other non-conformist movements job as well, is not just to look at the slumming, which was a semi-enjoyable activity, form of entertainment, but to try be more like Dolling and go, how can we help this individual person? And what's fascinating is I've just been indexing 10 years, and the amount of individual people that he speaks about, rather than this group of people, the poor, you might read. So if you read history books on Victorian England, you might say, people in the workhouse were like this, people thought this, and then you need to tap down into these individual stories, which slumming in the Victorian sense of hiring a carriage and going round the poor areas is never going to give you the story as to why the people are where they are.
So I think it's something really interesting there, because when we're talking about a lived faith, we're talking about Dolling as a person that was totally immersed in his community. And these weren't people that he walked past in the street. These were people he was having regular interaction with, regular conversations with. Am I right in thinking there's a bit in 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum where a lady's son has pawned her bed, and then Dolling buys her a new bed, of which the son promptly pawns that one as well. So they just buy another bed. I mean, it's incredible, but we don't think of that yet. You know, I suppose for Dolling that must have been quite common. I know that Sarah Wise in The Blackest Straits paints very similar pictures, and there's not a lot of time difference between the two periods. So I'm guessing for Dolling that must have been really something. And I suppose in some ways, and I hate to say it, that prostitution, we know that was one of his big things that he fought against, was seen as a way out of that. I mean, what's that matter?
Yeah, I would look at, I would go back to Dolling's criteria. They made one assessment, or he made one assessment about whether or not he could help someone. And that, and who they helped. And that is, he helped anyone he thought he could help. So that the mother in the bed, he thought he could help her, so he buys her a bed. The problem then becomes, again, she doesn't have a bed. He thinks he can help her, so he buys her a bed. And that's the only criteria. And yet 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum is a fantastic book. And I've got a release date for my copy, which is the 18th of November. You are welcome to purchase. If you're going to buy a copy to read it, wait till then, because honestly, that'll make me happy anyway. But it contains letters of people whose lives were greatly improved and changed because of this guy. And I know Sarah Wise has an interest in Dolling, and I've had conversations with her about Dolling, and she references him in The Blackest Streets, and he gets seen as, in his work, as really, really positive. But what's missing so often in writing about Dolling is his actual motivation. And really, it comes down to his faith. So his faith is why, and what he believes is why he does what he does. Now, someone like me, who's old and untrendy in the world of sort of history and faith, would say, well, that's what we all do. We all act out of what we believe. And so Dolling's politics, for example, which are very left for the day, and he would describe himself as socialism, but he'd also says in how they did what they did, this is our method of politics, as it were, is not mere socialism. It's not just socialism for socialism's sake. It's socialism because that's how he interpreted, particularly, Matthew 5 and 6. And so he looks at that and goes, we are to love our neighbor as well as ourselves, and we are to care for those around us. And yet, I would say one of the issues with today is that is what gets missed. So Dolling gets my old lecturer described Dolling as a man of 1,000 footnotes. Where when I started to research him for my undergraduate dissertation, I thought, oh, I know, I'll go to the library and I'll search for Dolling, or I'll go to Amazon and I'll search for Father Robert Radcliffe Dolling. That's bound to find me stuff. But the problem is he's such a bit part in history. So he gets not used badly, but he gets used by certain people just for one tiny thing. So Alistair Wilcox uses him to say it's all about the beauty of the building itself. And then Brad Bevan uses him saying, well, Dolling was an imperialist, which he certainly was. But when we go to his motivation is religion, when it comes to tackling prostitution, It's really important, and there are some funny stories. They are stories that will, I think, should make you equally smile and be devastated at the same time. Of his sisters who worked with the prostitutes and girls. So it's important to note that Dolling never did that. That wasn't his domain. His was the boys and the men. But they would go into the worst streets into Lamport and they would rescue those they were working with. And they opened this orphanage so that the solution is, particularly with girls, is they get taken off the mothers who were prostituting themselves as a way of surviving and making money. And then they would go and they would live in Southsea away from them. And Dolling, like, it's very different today, but Dolling really believed in the separation of children from, to use the 19th century term, the delinquent parents.
I mean, he did blame, or in his writing, he blames the parents quite a bit. There are instances in his work where he's talking about houses of ill repute, and he buys the houses for the mission, doesn't he? And then he throws everyone out of it and closes the housing down. So it's a very almost contemporary thing we see now, where we see drug dens boarded up and they have court orders put on them. No one's allowed inside the building for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And we see Dolling doing a very similar thing. At least that was my understanding.
Yeah, he talks about there's 50, I think he calls them bad houses. Again, there's a mixture of Victorian hyperbole and then the idea of, that which must not be said. And so he does use the word prostitution, but it is used there very, very scantly through the book. And he alludes to it like Victorian writing you would expect him to. But yeah, so he basically manages to buy them all before he leaves. And that's quite fascinating. So he talks about this idea of needing to remove prostitution, which, when you consider there's a large sailor population coming in and out through Lamport, there's a huge amount of pubs, and then prostitution often next door to the pub there. But yeah, he there's a really good story actually where he buys the gymnasium. There's a bit of competitive religion with the Salvation Army there. He buys the gymnasium and they open the gymnasium, and the house next door is one of these bad houses, and he discusses the having dinners and members of parliament and various bishops round, and that the noises from the bad house could be heard very clearly in the house, in the gymnasium in the house where they were. But what is really interesting is Dolling, when he arrives in Portsmouth, he goes, all I need to do is write to the landlords, tell them their houses are being used as, well, what we would say brothels, and then they'll kick them out. But he couldn't. He almost seems like he couldn't believe it, that the people went, as long as I get the rent, I don't care. And then the biggest problem was the one that was owned by the person that ran the brothel, and that's the one he really struggled to get closed down. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty much like today. And I mean, I used to live in Yeovil in Somerset, and which houses are the drugs, I don't know if den's the right word, but the ones that are used for dealing and the ones that are used for prostitution, these are often still known. And I would look at this and go, there are problems of this today, that houses are used for things that if we're going to live out any form of faith in within a Christian context or even any other context, we need to be thinking, is our work with the lowest people in society in that sense, and who is helping them? And that really is what Dolling saw his mission as. And I know you write about forgotten congregations, and I think that's really quite an important topic. And also and this is genuinely no comment on on the government or anything, but I'm fairly sure that anybody assessing the situation today is going to go, poverty is going to be on the rise. There are going to be difficult times ahead, and we need to think about what part is it that we can play in that. And I think Dolling and other slum priests and workers might have things and techniques to help us in dealing with that.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing about Dolling is we can look at Dolling and there's two parts of Dolling, as you say, it's the Victorian hyperload that we can set to one side, and it's very much the Dolling as a mission that we can look at and say, look, this is actually a model that we need to recognise. We need to recognise that we go and find people in those darkest corners of society, that we go down those streets that people don't go down. We don't cross the road for our own safety. We cross the road to make others safe. So yeah, there's definitely that. Though there is another side to Dolling, isn't there? I mean, I'm just thinking that we really should wrap this up and ask for people's questions. And I mean, I could talk to you for hours, Matthew. We often do, one way or another. If I asked you to sum up Dolling in 5 minutes and say, right, okay, so here we are people living and engaged in a modern university. We're doing modern scholarship, etc., etc. The Victorian period is well behind us. It's cast to historians really to look at it. What would your challenge of Dolling be for us to take away?
I think it's important in many ways, I think, to realize that society has many similar aspects as in Victorian England, in 100 and, well, when we're talking Dolling, 130 years ago in Portsmouth. And really it comes down to this, that the situation changed, that the people have housing has improved, but first of all, there's still plenty of poverty. Now, how we measure poverty is very different. But really, one of the key lessons of Dolling, I think, is he seems well ahead. And one of the reasons I find him the most fascinating is regarding mental and the connection between mental and physical health. He is further ahead than anyone else I have read at that time. And he says, and this is a paraphrase, he says, he obviously suffers from some form of mental health, some sort of bouts of melancholy, if not depression himself. But he says that where the distinction is between physical health and what he would say is like what we would call mental health is not always easy to distinguish. And he says about how if you can work on one, so if you can work on your mental health, how it aids your physical health, and if you can work on your physical health, how it aids your mental health, and how when you're struggling with one, you struggle with the other. And I would look at today, particularly, with the threat of extra lockdowns and the government saying we're not shielding people explicitly for their mental health, that again, we're having to deal with that balance between the risk of physical health and the risk of mental health. And how do we balance that? And I would say in helping people, Dolling balanced and shows a really good way in the stories of individuals that he tells. He does very, very well. And yet in his own life, he does very, very badly. He never takes any time off. Money gets raised so he can have a nice holiday. He spends it on the poor people because he feels too guilty. And so the balance in his life is all over the place. And he dies because, according to Clayton, he dies because he was too focused on everybody else. And now, as soon as Dolling dies in 1902, there is a huge gap in Poplar for people caring for the poor. And this is pre-welfare state. And this is, so pre-pensions and pre-sick pay. And Dolling thought a lot about water, water quality and things like that to the poor. And so I would say the lessons we can learn from Dolling is, one of the key ones is that we cannot look after other people with the exclusion of looking after ourselves. Jesus is quite clear. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say, love your neighbor and hate yourself. And that's really key. And so a lesson we can learn of an error, in my opinion, that Dolling made is that we need to be looking, people who are doing those things and caring for, people around them, that they really must look after themselves in equal measure.
I think that's very poignant words and something that we all need to go and reflect on and all consider. Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to invite questions now. I'm sure people have stored up quite a lot that they'd like to ask Matthew. I think AJ's got the first question. So do you want to ask that one, AJ, or do you want me to ask it as it's in the chat?
Yeah, I don't mind. It was just a personal note. Like, you speak of Dolling as someone you've spent so much time researching. You knew the ins and outs of his personality, and it was a great, insightful talk. Thank you so much for that. It was just a personal note. How did you come to know of Dolling, and what made you want to research him more?
Okay, how I ended up liking Dolling is because I basically I used to live in Portsmouth, and then my toilet broke in the house. So I said to my family, right, we lived in Somerset at the time, let's go and stay somewhere away. So we went and stayed in Portsmouth, and I went to the Dickens Museum, and they sold these things called Portsmouth papers. And I've always been interested in religion. I was doing a history degree in my second year at the time. And I found one of these Portsmouth papers, which are single academic essays, called The Anglican Revival in Victorian Portsmouth. And I was like, that sounds right up my street. So I bought it for about 65p. And then I left it in my bag. And when I went to my next lecture, my lecturer was late. So I thought, I'll just pull it out and started reading it. So I started reading it. And then when he came in, he picked it up and had a look. And he just looked at it and went, yeah, Father Dolling. And I was like, what? Absolutely no idea. I had no idea. But being, and I don't know what level of student, where if any of you are students or what, but you just go, well, I was an undergraduate, so I went to my lecturer. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I had no idea what he was talking about. So went home and thought I better look up this guy. So the mighty Wikipedia, which never lies, but never used in an essay, obviously. I went, this guy sounds brilliant. So I ordered 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum and read it, wrote an essay at the end of the year. And then I went, why has no one heard of this guy? And yet everyone has heard of Dickens. So from then on, it became like this strange obsession with this man who is outside of the religious circles that I've ever moved in. So I was kind of, caught in a semi-lie in that sense, but I utterly fascinated by this man going, and really, so I approach it from a history rather than a theological perspective, though I try to do very much. So the master's that I'm writing at the moment has a large element of history of theology within it. But yeah, I'm just fascinated by how somebody who's so impactful, who the streets are lined in Portsmouth and London, in Portsmouth when he opens at St Agatha's, and that all these people mourn when he dies, and these books are written about him, and he's mentioned in Parliament several times, and yet here I was in 2000 and a bit, because I did my degree late, 2000 and sort of 17 or 18 or 17, and no one had ever heard of him, and no one was writing about him. and nothing beyond a short Wikipedia page could be found out about him. And I found it amazing. And so what I've done since then is gone, there must be thousands of these people. And so I've beginning to make it both my career and my mission to bring into sort of mainstream academic debate these kinds of people, so that they're no longer just footnotes, but they are people who are genuinely studied for the benefit that we can get from them.
Thank you so much.
It's a really interesting question from Andrew here. Perhaps, Andrew, you want to expand on this, but connection of dolling and burnout in modern day clergy. Do you know whether that's ever been looked at all, Matthew?
I would suggest that I have never read anything of it, but I would suggest that Dolling specifically would be a very, very good person to research in relation to that, because you can see his burnout in the way that Osborne and Clayton speak about him, and then you can see Dolling being burnt out in retrospect. So he acknowledges it afterwards and talks about how it affected him. But I mean, I tend to hold the Clayton view that burnout made Dolling make bad decisions. And so again, I would encourage somebody, and I would certainly love to read something on that, because again, I think I'm not interested in Dolling in just about how he was and that, you know, was he a great guy? Did people love him? Just go, how can people like this help us today? And how can we learn from them? How can we learn from, you know, inner city mission or you know, and things like that, I think are really, really important. So Andrew, you should do that.
It's a challenge for you, Andrew. Anyone else? Dave, you look like you're pausing over the mute button.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you very, very much for your contribution so far. It is really interesting and exciting. Curiously, I only came across Dolling through Peter's undergraduate dissertation, and I'm a Portsmouth clergy. So I did my curacy down in Portsmouth, was ordained in Portsmouth, and walked past the church on numerous occasions and knew nothing of Dolling's history. So it is quite fascinating to hear so much about him, and just looking at the area, you know, some things just haven't changed at all. The buildings have changed, but the poverty in that area is still so noticeable and so physical and tangible as you walk around it, even with the shopping arcade being the poorer cousin to Gunwharf just round the corner. And I suppose it's with that heavy heart of regret that you look at his life and you look at all he was striving to achieve, and he made such steps forward, and yet the area still seems to be one that struggles quite heavily with issues of poverty, prostitution and drugs, and trying to think what we could do to move that forward. You know, I love the way he operated with, actually, if there was something I could tangibly do, then I will do it. And that seemed to be his general motto, even though it led to his kind of burnout.
Yeah, I think so. One of the ways I think that would be helpful is these kind of people, they tended to be very, very personality driven. So they go, well, Dolling is Dolling, and Dolling does what Dolling does, and Dolling can raise £50,000 in 10 years because he's Dolling. And so I think it would be really useful in a going forward way to go, well, how can we harness those kind of people, which I think still exists? There are people with great personalities who are, you know, able to convince people, rich people, to part with money to help poorer places. But it's about incorporating them into part of a team. And I always look at people like Dolling and I go, he probably, to use a football analogy, I support Yeovil Town, which no one will convince me they're not the best team in the world, right? But the fact is, first of all, they're not. But the fact is, we keep getting managers who were really good assistant managers and really bad managers. And there's this idea in business as well that everybody gets promoted one level above their competency. And so I look at Dolling and I go, I mean, I don't think he'd have done it, but he would make a really good number 2. So like Father Stanton remained a curate for 50 years, that's a good idea. And yet we're very, very, I think the church and society are very good at pushing people forward to be number 1. Whereas actually if Dolling remained as number 2 and could really focus on raising the money and somebody else doing some of the work and a boss going, you will go on holiday right now and you will have a rest and you will leave here, then we might lose some of that burnout. But yeah, I mean, I lived in Portsmouth when I got married in 2000 and don't tell my wife I'm struggling over this, 2004. and I would say I worked in a children's home in Somerstown. And I would go, you know, there is still huge poverty. There are clearly prostitution problems. And so as Lamport itself post-war was demolished, these problems become the problems of the next group of housing. And I think there is room for the charismatic Dollings figure today. And I think they do exist, but they need to be part of a team, which in fairness, you know, you were never going to harness Dolling to be part of a team. But I think, you know, the structure today would hopefully allow that to be more the case.
And I love the stories of how hands-on, shall we say, with folk he was. And I just wonder how much of that was actually living where he was living and doing what he was doing. You couldn't afford not to be that force to be reckoned with, because otherwise you would get nowhere in that community. You had to be respected, and to some respect, fear and trembling will have played a big part in that.
Yeah, I think so. And the first children's service at the beginning of 10 years is a really good example. So he goes to run this first children's service, and these boys are creating a problem inside the church. So he bangs their heads together and stops the service, throws them out of the church. And then you go, well, you know, you certainly can't be doing that as a clergy today. But back then, I think you just go, I mean, that created problems with the mothers coming and shouting and swearing at him and him closing the service early, and this sort of Pied Piper of Hamelin sort of idea of all the children following him as the parents, the mothers of these obviously boys yelling and swearing at him all the way to his house. But I think, you know, that's the kind of start Dolling needed. He wasn't adverse to throwing people down the stairs. He wasn't adverse to going and dragging people out whilst they're prostituting themselves with men. But you know, what else do you do? And it's that idea of he talks about very much of this manly, bringing the manliness back into Christianity. That's what the gym's all about. And Callum Brown, a really interesting religious historian, I think he wrote a book called The Death of Christian Britain, where he decides that in the 1960s Christianity explodes and dies one day, and he talks about the history of it and how Christianity itself is feminized at this point. So it's expressing itself in the feminine, in the feelings. And then you've got all these men running around, you know, fairly horny men, as it were, running around Lamport, needing to find somewhere to put that sort of aggression and passion into. And so he has this idea of exhausting them out. Is such a good idea. So you open the gymnasium, you make them knackered, and you send them to bed, and their mums go, yeah, but they're not more Christian, but, you know, they are behaving.
It's really interesting because I was at a sports and wellbeing webinar the other evening, and what they were talking about is the most dangerous period for children is that 3 to 5 p.m. is when they come out of school and they have nowhere to go to, and looking at that. And you really get the sense with Dolling that's what he was doing. There are these periods where children and men are in very dangerous situation. There's temptation, so the gym and other things provide an outlet for that. Would you agree with that, Matthew?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think it's just the I've got two daughters, but I've got one daughter that is like a quite utterly bouncy, really sporty, and really you know can cause the odd problem if her physical if we don't physically wear her out by doing stuff in the day. And so I do think, I remember being a young boy myself, and I'd come home from school and I'd get changed and I'd pick up a football and I'd go back to school and I'd play football for 2 hours. And I think, what Dolling talks about is getting to Landport, and there's this chaos, but a chaos mixed with nothingness. There's nothing to do. What people are doing on the streets is playing, because there's a lot of abattoirs there, they're playing with animal bones on the streets. They can't afford to buy anything, so they play animal bones. And you go, well, these people, of course, the people who aren't, who don't have any focus on either physical or mental focus, they're going to cause more problems. And when I worked in children's home, kids that were kept busy, and you weren't allowed to say kicking off, but kids that were kept busy and worn out didn't cause anywhere near as much trouble as kids that were just left to it. So the lazier the care worker, the more trouble the kid would cause them, and actually then the more the care worker had to do. And it was a strange vicious circle. But I would look at it today and go, we need to, in sort of the idea of living faith, is you look at the religions and denominations that are growing, and actually intellectually we should be pushing people as well, both intellectually and physically, as it were. But intellectually we need a bit more robustness, a bit more working of the brain. Wears people out more, and is good for people, and it makes them less bored, and so therefore they will cause you less problems, if that will make sense. My dog's come to join me.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to add or bring to the conversation? No. So I think that's, if we leave it there, because I think that's a really poignant point to go away and reflect on, and I think that's a really good point that you've brought to us, Matthew, that, intellectual and physical activities are good for well-being, and we have a responsibility where we can to help others achieve that as well, especially for those of us that work in chaplaincy. That's definitely something to take away and reflect on how we can do that best. So I thank you. Thank you for joining us for this week's God Talk. Please join us next Tuesday when we will continue to discuss what it means to have a lived faith.